Hello, welcome back to Bonaventure Time. I'm back here with another video, and today I've been getting a lot of questions from people on what is personalism, because I've mentioned it numerous times in a couple of videos I've made. In my video I made on Wojtyla, Aquinas, and Hildebrand, I mentioned it, and I mentioned it off and on in other areas. In perhaps in a vague way. And so I kind of want to explain what is personalism and then talk a little bit about the personalist vision in light of Wojtyla, Hildebrand, and a little bit of Stein. Personalism is a movement in philosophy, you could say culminating in the 20th century, but certainly is present in many different philosophies in different eras, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But it's a movement in philosophy that puts a priority on the subject. Now, I've mentioned this in relation to Descartes and his Cartesian method and the change in anthropology that he made, and saying we are thinking persons. That is subjectivity for Descartes, but it is a flawed and in many ways would lead to Hegelian conflict theory and subjectivism in that kind of sense. Personalism in its priority of the subject looks to man's subjectivity in light of scholastic metaphysics. There is an ontological problem that many personalists and even phenomenologists would face, and that is if you put for Husserl, right, everything comes from the ego, the I, and the consciousness, and that's how he moves forward. That's phenomenology. That is its method. But there's a hard problem with this reconciliation of what is the human person if you're going to stress that much on the I. Exactly what Descartes did. The human person is merely a thinking person, right? And it's confusion of person and nature. Namely, a person is an individual substance with a rational nature, as Boethius would define it. Phenomenology in Husserl, right, many phenomenologists would struggle with this ontological problem of where does the ego fit. Edith Stein would be a great assistance in that, in her harmonization of the Thomistic philosophy and personalism and phenomenology, in her works Act and Potency and Being and Essence. I won't talk about those in depth here. Perhaps I'll make a video on that if you want. But essentially, it for her, the ego would fit into the rational nature that comes forth and becomes consciousness of objects outside of oneself, but it still remaining an individual substance, right? So those are very Aristotelian terms. Personalism is the priority of the subject, looks into man's subjectivity within the realm of that metaphysics of scholasticism. And when I say subjectivity, we're not thinking about the cogiton in Descartes, right? The thinking person. We're thinking more in light of the interiority of man. So it stresses man's it stresses a couple things. It stresses incommunicability, and I'll talk about that in a second, and it stresses man's cognition and desire, namely man's longing for truth and the good, right? Cognition, the capacity to reason, right? The rational nature to desire truth, and desire, namely man to apprehend and receive and pursue the good. But I mentioned incommunicability. What that means simply is something that is, you could say, it is like something unique to you, a uniqueness to someone, right? So you have a person that is communicable. There are powers within nature, right? Within the soul, right? Desire for truth, cognition, right? Rationality, imagination, all these things, right? That is communicable, right? It's shared across different people. But there's things that are incommunicable that are distinct to you, right? And for humans, this is going to be different potencies, and unique, you could say within like ancient Greek terms, distinctive property, or as the medievals would call it, differentiae. But it's something basically that's just unique to you. And personalism is going to stress that a lot. And it's going to look into what a personalist, Dr. John Crosby, would say, the selfhood of the human person. And so if you look at this, you can look at this incommunicability in many ways. And really at the heart of incommunicability, it really just means, another way you could say it is, no one can will this for you. Only you can will this. Only you can do this, right? And there's many different interesting takes on that you can see in Soren Kierkegaard. Even Martin Heidegger in his existential phenomenology mentions a bit concepts on simply trying to kind of expand communicability. I will say I'm not as big of a fan of Martin Heidegger in his existential phenomenology. Existentialism is perhaps a video I might make or is a concept I might make a video on. It's a very interesting branch. It's commonly attributed, and rightfully so, in many ways, to Jean-Paul Sartre, but he is not everything that existentialism is. There are very interesting concepts in it. Heidegger's one, though, I don't necessarily agree on many things, because essentially it's existentialism, it's humanism, so that it is precedes what it is. There's no essences. Your essence is simply defined by your existence. Anyway, sorry, that we're not talking about that. Yeah, so the incommunicability, I'm losing my train of thought here. Incommunicability is simply that no one can will this for you. So it's a very big concept in light of Wojtyla. Now that there's this general understanding of what is personalism and what is it stressing. Well, before I go into Wojtyla and Hildebrand, I should say this personalism is commonly misunderstood to be a philosophical branch, or you could say like a doctrinal methodology, right? Because if you look at scholasticism, they have their methodology. The Aristotelians have their methodology. The Platonics have their methodology, right? Or Platonists, I should say. So all these different methodologies, the Cartesian, really personalism is not a methodology, nor is it really a doctrinal philosophy. You could say it's a movement. That's why I keep referring to it as that. It's a movement. So you're gonna see there's gonna be a lot of people who claim to speak in the name and the true heart of personalism, and they were flawed in many ways. In many ways, they they have this false distortion that personalism, in stressing the subject, stresses how the subject feels. That's what, as a personalist, we would call that subjectivism, and not true subjectivity. Again, there's like conflict theories within Hegel, and even you could see things about that on a sociological level in Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So there's a distinction there. It's a movement. It's similar to phenomenology in that, because you're going to see phenomenology kind of go across the board. Most phenomenologists are personalists. That is something. So phenomenology and personalism is connected in a very high way, because right in stressing the subject, that's where personalism really finds a shoot and really spreads out. And again, phenomenology started in Husserl in the late 1900s, and it carries on into the 20th century. So that's why personalism culminates in the 20th century. But there's a history to it, and there's many great movers in personalism, and that would be Wojtyla, Hildebrand, and Stein. Predominantly, I would say they were some of the greatest personalist thinkers. So I'll start with Wojtyla. Now, Wojtyla is going to use personalism as the basis for love and responsibility. His way of combating utilitarianism is through the personalist philosophy. And really, it's clear. If you're watching this video, you're going to see that this kind of becomes clear in how he begins the book, namely that we are subjects and objects, subjects in a world of objects, that we come to become really consciousness of other objects, but we ourselves are subjects. And this is where Stein's a personalist as well. That is a very similar philosophy to Stein's theory of empathy. I have made a video on that, so I won't talk about or just explain that. But if you want to learn more about Stein's theory of empathy, please go and check out my video on it, and that might make this video a little more accessible. And so Wojtyla starts very similar to how Stein would write her theory of empathy, and namely that we become consciousness of people, not just as objects, but as subjects, right? So what he's doing here is very interesting, and it's really a combatant, and he's calling out other philosophers who wrote philosophies of community and love. And I won't go into that as well. I might make a separate video on that as well, with Wojtyla's combat against Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. But this is how he starts Love and Responsibility, and it's this idea that you're receiving a subjectivity of another. You receive them, namely, you become conscious that they're not just objects, but they perceive the world and they act in the world, right? It's similar to how I do, right? This person is not just an object, but I see them acting not just in the world, but upon the world. So, right, there's the acting person. This is a big thing for Wojtyla, and this is how he starts Love and Responsibility. And then he makes this beautiful, there's this beautiful section on the command to love in the Gospels and the personalist principle, right? He says the law of the Gospel, the command to love, fully entails the personalist principle. Now, the personalist principle has a negative and a positive formulation. And its negative formulation is a person must not merely be a means to an end for another, right? You can't just use someone merely. And he does a greater description. I'm hoping to make just a separate video on Love and Responsibility, so I won't go into too much into it and make this really dense. So hopefully I'll make a video on that. But a person is not merely a means to an end for another, and then the positive formulation of the personalist principle is they must be loved for their own sake. Now this is beautiful, and it's actually in Gaudium et Spes. I believe it's paragraph 20. Oh, now I'm forgetting. So it's in the 20s. It's like 20 or 24, one of those. This is something that we've adopted in the Catholic faith, loving, right? This is very much contrary to the utilitarian movement, right? And this is, utilitarian has at its root uti, which is a Latin word for, right, using, but using for pleasure. So utilitarianism basically states a maximization of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. So it's basically a philosophy that the ends justify the means, right? And so uti, whatever you use, you can use anything you want, or you have to make use of things in order to maximize your pleasure. And this is what Wojtyla is combating, because this idea of utilitarianism within marriage is, right, if it maximizes my pleasure, and it turns out and it feels good, and it's apparently seemingly is good, then it justifies, whatever I just did, like contraception or premarital relations, right? So all these things that really distort the true nature of love is what utilitarianism would give lenience to, and Wojtyla is combating that with the personalist principle, and I think the personalist principle deserves a little further reflection, because in saying we are not merely a means to an end, right? The reason he puts merely in there is because we do use people, and it's not always immoral, right? When you're doing a job and you're working on something, right? There's the boss, and he's got his workers, right? In a way, he's using them to get the job done, right? But it's not immoral, and this is a big concept in Love and Responsibility, because they have a common end, right? They have a good that they are a common good that they are working towards, right? So this is why he is using them, but they have a common good that they both agree upon and they're working towards, right? So it's not just merely using that person, right? So that's in the negative formulation. And the positive formulation, loving them for their own sake, that means you don't love them because they did something for me. You don't love them in any way relative to me. And this is, again, very much in contrasting to the thought of Simone de Beauvoir and her theory of the other alongside Jean-Paul Sartre and Hegel. In this idea that we're not just relative to one another, but they have value, and that's Hildebrandian terms, value within themselves, right? They are a value in it of itself, and you love them for their own sake. And Wojtyla, it's one of the most beautiful lines in Love and Responsibility. I cannot resist in saying it in this video. It is, a person is a good to which the only proper and adequate response is love. And so this is why he uses the personalist principle, because in a sense, right, you see the command to love, in the law, right, we have justice, but the law is a law of love, and this is what he's getting at. If a person is a good to which the only and proper and adequate response is love, and we love them, fulfilling the commandment to love, right, obeying it, we are rendering justice what is their due to them. So there's the justice, and you see that in the law, but it's also a movement of law. It's not merely justice, and he's gonna explicitly say that, right? Love fully entails and embodies justice, but is not the other way around. Justice does not fully embody the true nature of love, right? Right? All justice should be love, but justice does not contain all of love within it, but love contains all of justice within it, right? And that's a beautiful distinction and reflection that he makes. And this is what he does. He uses the personalist principle and he relates it to the command to love. It's a very beautiful section. And again, I'm not making a video on love and responsibility, so there's 3 other chapters. That was just the first chapter, or there's 4 other chapters actually. But that's kind of like, you could say, an introduction to love and responsibility, and it's a very beautiful book. It is my favorite book I've ever read. And it's very beautiful, and he uses the personalist philosophy to combat utilitarianism. Wojtyla is one of the greatest movers, I should say, in personalism, in an authentic personalism, because what made Wojtyla so great in comparison to his predecessors in the personalist movement, namely those who spoke in the name of it but kind of distorted it, would be like Max Scheler at times was very dangerous. Even perhaps Adolf Reineck, excuse me. And you also see, right, the false senses of personalism in Sartre, even Heidegger. I would argue sometimes in Merleau-Ponty. So Wojtyla really, I think what corrects that is that he grounds himself in a Thomistic philosophy, in that scholastic metaphysics, right? There's that ontological problem of really who is the person, and he really grounds himself in the Aristotelian Thomistic definition of man, right? Coming off of Boethius, an individual substance with a rational nature, and he really uses that to ground himself in reality, and but it allows him to do a deeper analysis into the human person and his interiority. So that's Wojtyla. Hildebrand, Hildebrand was a great personalist, and perhaps more explicit than Wojtyla. That is debatable, though, for sure. But Hildebrand, for him, personalism is going to start at the basis of his philosophy, and at the basis of Hildebrandian philosophy is the value theory. Now, if any of you are familiar with Max Scheler, you would understand that this is coming from him. Max Scheler made a value system for his philosophy and for his formalism in ethics. And what it simply is different values according to how it relates to the person. It's basically expanding the equivocation of value that you see identified in Plato's Republic and Aristotle's philosophy, and basically all the medievals. Understanding an equivocation of importance. You'd see that in Kantian philosophy as well. And Scheler is expanding that, and he develops a rather complex, maybe not complex, but a very interesting system of values according to how they relate to the human person, according to their goodness, their importance towards the good. So Hildebrand studied under Scheler, right? Learned this value system, but his value theory is not like Scheler's in that it relates to the human person and to different degrees of goodness. For Hildebrand, value means in and of itself. It is important in and of itself, right? It's a good if so of value. Is this kind of axiological basis that Scheler would follow, but in and of itself. Even Merleau-Ponty would understand this, adopting from Hildebrand. Stein would adopt this from Hildebrand, right? This really shift in axiology. What axiology is, if you don't know it, is a study of the value theory, a study of different natures of values. So for Hildebrand, it's a huge shift in axiology, and his study of the value is in and of itself. So a person is a value in and of itself, not relative to me. This has value, right? So you'd see this in his ethics, also his aesthetics. You're going to see him go through this equivocation, right? So something has value if it leads me to this. Something has value if it leads me to a good, right? And he's kind of, in a way, remarking Scheler's value theory, but then he remarks that there is a value, that there are some things that you know are good because it happened, but there are some things that you know it was better that it happened, right? It's a good in and of itself, free of self-gratification. That's a huge thing for him, and so this is a system of value, and it's very much the personalist thought that Wojtyla would adopt. um, and love and responsibility. Now, when I said Wojtyla and Stein's theory of empathy are very similar, it's very interesting. They are super similar in many ways. Stein and Wojtyla never met, nor did they, they were not familiar with each other's writings, or at least Wojtyla wasn't with Stein's. But Hildebrand and Wojtyla were very familiar with one another in their writings as well, and Wojtyla would adopt a lot of Hildebrandian theology and philosophy, so that's why you're going to see a lot of similarities there as well. And so that's Hildebrand and his value theory. That is at the heart, at the core of Hildebrand's philosophy. Everything would come forth from that. There's a beautiful work that Hildebrand wrote in defense of purity. It's really a philosophy of marriage and the philosophical nature of purity, but also he uses it in the philosophical analysis of purity. He uses that to kind of go into a deeper analysis of celibacy and virginity for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and that is referencing Matthew. And it's a very beautiful analysis, but he uses personalism in that, right? Everything has this axiological basis in the virtues, right? A person has a value, right? So this person, and if you want an example of it in terms of beauty, right? Because he was such a fierce defender of beauty, and his aesthetics, right? This is his argument for beauty being an objective. It is a value, right? You can have a consciousness of beauty, but there's a term he would call lateral consciousness, and what that is like, through the experiencing of it, you can come to the essence of it, right? It's kind of like the eidetic reduction in Husserl. I made a video on that if you're not familiar with that. That's in Edmund Husserl, Introduction to Phenomenology. So if you want to check that out to understand this, I would do that. And so what lateral consciousness is, basically, like, if you reflect upon the experiencing of this, you can come to the essence and the meaning of something. So, right, when you become consciousness, and he would call this frontal consciousness, and it's basically equivalent to intentionality for Edmund Husserl. Frontal consciousness of a person I love, right? And over time, the lateral consciousness of experiencing like a self-reflection on that experience, not only did I become conscious of someone I love, but I become conscious of what it means to be in love, right? Through the self-reflection flowing forth, right? And he would argue you can't have that with beauty. And if you think about it, right, he's right, because you can have a consciousness of beautiful things, but you really can't understand really fully the meaning of that beauty and the experiencing of that, right? The true essence of beauty, right? And I won't go into that because that's years of aesthetics, but that's what lateral consciousness is. And so he would use that in his value of beauty, right? If you met someone, say you met someone with beauty, you wouldn't say that they have beauty, right, in Hegelian terms because I have the right sentiment or something like that. You would say, right, that they're beautiful outside of my experiencing of that beautiful, right? And that's, again, you can't know the true full essence of beauty, the true the deepest meaning of beauty. You can understand a little bit of it, but you can't possess beauty, and that's a huge thing for Hildebrand. But it's this value that's outside of me, right? It's free of my self-gratification, not beautiful because I experienced it. You're not beautiful because I have this right sentiment, right? You're not beautiful because you lead me to the good, right? It's this idea that you're beautiful in and of yourself, right? That beauty is this value in and of itself, but delighting in it is a good thing. That's what he would use. So his personalist philosophy very much is used in the context of marriage, like Wojtyla, but he uses it a lot in his ethics and uses it a lot in his aesthetics. It's very unique, and Hildebrand was a great mover in personalism, and he as well was very grounded in the Thomistic metaphysics. He did not struggle with an ontological problem. And Stein as well would do this as well. She was a personalist. She got that a lot from her mentors. She had nearly the same teachers as Hildebrand. They're 2 years apart, same birthday. Both studied under Husserl. Hildebrand owes perhaps more to Shaler, whereas Stein owes more to Husserl, in that she was his assistant. You could say she was perhaps a queen of phenomenology, as some have remarked her as. She would use the personalist, and I've kind of talked about that in her theory of empathy. And what you see there is a stressing of the subject and receiving another subjectivity. And that's a different way to look at a human person, right? It's not just through act, potency, genus, species, right? These Aristotelian terms of an object, right? Or a substance. But really, it's the receiving of a subject, the subjectivity, right? Your joy becomes my joy because I become conscious of you as a subject acting upon the world, right? And that's what empathy really is, right? When someone's rejoicing, you may not, say someone's rejoicing because something good happened to them. That good that happened to them didn't happen to you, but their joy can become your joy because you become conscious of their subjectivity, namely their experiencing of that joy. And you can, through rationalization, know the motives of that joy, and you can adopt that joy as your joy, right? It becomes your joy, but it's their primordial content, to use more specific terms. Again, I use that and explain that more in my video on Stein's problem of empathy. And so Stein's empathy really is a basis for love. It's a foundation for love. It's very much a great great achievement in the realm of personalism, namely in how can we look at others. And neuroscience actually is confirming a lot of what Edith Stein wrote about in her theory of empathy. And in mirror neurons, the self-projection of yourself upon another is actually being confirmed today. And so Stein's theory of empathy is absolutely brilliant and a great achievement for personalism and how we view another. So I hope this helps. I know I didn't really go into depth into texts on personalism. I'm hoping to do a whole video on Love and Responsibility. It is my favorite book, but it is dense and there's just so much to talk about. I'm still trying to really make notes on how to condense that into a accessible way into a video, hopefully at like a 30-minute max. Which I still feel like wouldn't do justice. And so I'm hoping to get that out. And Hildebrand, I'm hoping to make more separate videos on text as well, and Stein as well. But I hope this helps and clears up what exactly is personalism. And I really encourage you to take upon yourself to read different personalist texts that are huge, like Love and Responsibility. Hildebrand's Aesthetics is a fantastic read. The Theory of Empathy, on the problem of empathy, Edith Stein's dissertation. Recommend that. But there are other great personalist texts. Dr. John Crosby has one, The Selfhood of the Human Person. The Human Person. There's The Personalism of John Paul II by Crosby. Sokolowski has great works in personalism. So there's great authors, and I highly encourage you to read it because I think it's a great movement in philosophy. So I hope this clears everything up, and I hope to see you next time.